we've gone through enough surgeries and hard things that there's no one I'd rather go through it with, you know? There's such an intimate bond there. I think once you have children and you see each other in compromising situations and you still love each other, and even when I can remember he had a really bad hand injury when we were going through a hard time. And but it was so easy to just get up early and help you get around and get dressed and everything. And it was easy because we had formed good habits, and I knew I loved you.
To me, life is exciting. And even when things are hard and difficult, it's still exciting to think about what's next and what's coming next. And, you know, I look forward to the days when life isn't quite as busy, but you know, we're still doing life together. We're still having fun together. We enjoy going places together, getting out of town, eating our way through a city, and seeing great lawns and landscapes, and going to botanical gardens. And I just look for more and more of that, and then seeing the girls grow and their relationships with their husbands and their kids to come. It's just, I don't know. To me, life is exciting, and I wouldn't want to be going through it alone, and definitely don't want to go through it with anybody other than Lori. I mean, we got 40 years of figuring each other out. And to me, life is exciting, and I just look forward to the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and on. So.
I think there's great reward for sticking it out. I think there's instances where people haven't, and I understand that, but I'm grateful that we have.
I'm Jimmy Evans. For more than 40 years, I've helped couples build strong, lasting marriages. But I'll be honest, mine almost didn't make it. My wife Karen and I were on the brink of divorce until the night that I got down on my knees and asked God to teach me how to be a husband. And what He showed me changed everything. In my new course, we'll walk through the laws that make every marriage work, the same truths that saved mine. Whether your marriage is struggling or thriving, these principles will help you build a relationship rooted in God's Word, one that's secure, satisfying, and built to last a lifetime. Let me join you on your marriage journey and help you discover how beautiful marriage can be when you do it the way God designed.
So the resources we have here at XO Marriage are amazing. They work for couples that we see all the time, but they're tried and true, and I believe the real reason they work is because they're biblical. God is the one who is the foundation of all of the resources we have here. And if we do life, if we do marriage His way, through His Word and His truth, we will succeed in all that we do. And that's what we strive for here at XO Marriage, is to really have that foundation built on God's Word and His truth.
Hi, welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn. The topic we're going to discuss is boundaries, which I know is an important topic for all of us, specifically in marriage, and that's where we're going to focus and concentrate is in the area of just marital boundaries and how that can be a blessing when done well, how that can maybe backfire when when those are implemented poorly. So we're going to jump in here shortly, but before we do, I just want to let you know that we did create like a companion guide for you guys to follow along. So you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can click the link down in the description below and upload it that way. So those are the two different ways that you can use the companion guide. It won't be exact to what I'll discuss and talk about during this time, but it'll pretty closely align. So let me just pray for our time, and then we will jump in. Heavenly Father, thank you for just this opportunity to discuss how to continue to grow in our relationships and put a healthy foundation in place. And a lot of times that can be through the arena of boundaries, and know that that's a topic that affects all of us in different ways, and maybe in the past and currently where the relationship is. So we trust you for this time and what's presented, and we ask it in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I just want to make a disclaimer that the area of boundaries, there's lots of different resources on that. People have different opinions and ideas about how those should be implemented or when they're good and not good. And so these are more guidelines that I'm going to share and present to you guys just as you're in your marriage journey or relationship journey, where maybe we tried again to have done that in an unhealthy way, and what are healthier opportunities to present boundaries and hopefully abide by those when that is helpful to keeping the marriage moving in the right direction. And so I just want to go over some overview of just boundaries, just some ideas. And so boundaries should guard the heart of your marriage, not expose the heart of your marriage. So a lot of times when boundaries are not in place, it exposes the heart of the marriage to attack. And so really think of that idea of how can we best guard our marriage with where we are now and where we want to be moving forward. The next are just distinguishing between reactional and intentional boundaries. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we try to put boundaries in place through a reaction versus maybe thinking through it and then putting that boundary in place when it's needed. The next is how does God want us to understand boundaries? And a lot of times that's specific to how He's going to speak to your heart and maybe what's going on internally. And that can be a lot of times through prayer. Sometimes God's word can maybe give you indication, understanding of when that boundary is needed. Boundaries should work toward building trust and continuing to build trust, or where maybe trust has been eroded, that can help in building trust back in the relationship. It should often, and we talk about this almost in every Lunch and Learn and arena that we have a platform to share, is that we want to look at beliefs, because a lot of times the thinking going on leads to the outcome, right? Whatever I'm believing, a consequence will follow. And so that's important to understand, is just what is the thinking going on surrounding boundaries, the avoidance of them, putting those in place. There is a difference between general boundaries and specific boundaries. General boundaries can just be, like, hey, this is good for our relationship when it comes to, the phone, and we don't have the phone around us when we are eating a meal together, or in this type of situation, where a specific boundary more is applicable to that maybe individual spouse, that they need that boundary specifically for themselves. So there can be sort of general boundaries and specific boundaries. And then I want you to understand that in boundaries, God's heart is always, I think, for restoration and healing when that is possible. And so, the goal is when we put this boundary in place, if there's been brokenness or hurt that needs to be healed, that boundary should lead us toward restoration in that area where hurt and pain has existed. And so one of the things I want to look at are what are maybe outside influences that can affect us, and boundaries need to be in place because that's an outside influence that could lead to relational disconnect. It could just lead to us not spending the right time together and how we spend that time together, because there are constantly things that are competing for our time and attention from the outside world. One example could just be friendships. Just how can that affect the relationship because we've placed maybe too high of a priority on friends in whatever category or arena to where the marriage can suffer in that area. Sometimes that can even lead to opposite sex boundaries that are needed. There can be different thoughts or opinions on opposite sex. I would say one tool in your guys' tool belt is maybe have a conversation about how do you see opposite sex in your relationship. Because I could have a definition that says, oh, I think that's okay to engage in this way or that way, where the other one's like, oh, I don't quite see opposite sex that way. So you guys have to have that discussion and understanding so that you can put a healthy boundary in place. One of the areas for my wife Amy and I where we had to, I wouldn't say it was an issue, it was unintentional potentially, but I remember one time at a place that I worked, this lady that I worked with, we were going to a landscape center to look at plants and stuff like that. And so she just, said, hey, would your wife be okay with us riding together? I didn't think twice about it. This was about probably 10 years ago. I grew up with two sisters. My best friends growing up were girls. So I just sort of had that inherent boundary where I just didn't really think about the impact or effects of maybe how that could impact Amy unintentionally. And so I was like, that's a good thought. Let me call Amy and get her feedback before we make that decision, or I see what's best here. And it wasn't that it was necessarily maybe wrong, but it maybe wouldn't have been best for our marriage. So I called Amy. She was fine with that and said, yeah, go for it. If you need to, you can ride with her. And so we did. Now, would I maybe approach that the same today? I don't know, because that could have exposed the heart of our relationship unintentionally. There was no ill will. And so, after that, I just debriefed with Amy about, yeah, this is the conversation we had, and this is what happened, and this is what we did, and etc. But I think the important thing is I checked in with Amy. I didn't assume that it would be okay. And so I think that's important. And if she would have said, no, I'm uncomfortable with that, I would have jumped in my own car and met the friend there at the landscape nursery, and that would have been great, because my highest value was guarding the heart of our marriage and what was of help to Amy to feel comfortable. Some people can have real strong opinions about opposite sex and never, ride in a car with someone. And, part of that is based upon history, vulnerabilities, just what's best in that situation. And so, I think it ultimately is what works for the marriage in that arena. The workplace, there might be boundaries with workplace because that's an outside influence. Serving your church or community, sometimes we can become married to our church or community and the marriage suffers because, the goal is in those situations, how do we create margin for the marriage to be healthy and grow? And what are those outside influences, again, that can affect or impact the marriage in a negative way? One more area is extended family. That's a big one in the years that I have worked with couples in our marriage intensive setting and doing that for over 14 years now, is a big one is extended family, and especially in-laws. Some think it's great, to have this close relationship, and for others, that's a challenge or an issue, and I believe it interferes in our marriage. And so it's looking at those outside influences, again, that can lead to relational disconnect and lack of intimacy in our marriage. Those are some examples. Again, there could probably be more that we could discuss, but just wanted to present. Think of those things that are external to the marriage. And so now I want to look at what are maybe areas within the marriage where we need to consider boundaries. Those could be family system or kids. And what I mean by the family system is just how our family does life, internally, and how we spend our time and interact with each other or don't interact with each other. Past relationships, say if there was a past marriage or relationship that was, long-term and it ended, but there hasn't been healing, that can be something from within where, I'm trying to get a need met, or sometimes boundaries, we need in the marriage boundaries that be like, I need some alone time. And because someone has such a high need to constantly be around their spouse and they're insecure if they're not, sometimes boundaries are needed just to give space for breathing, maybe in the marriage, just to consider that. Wiring and personality types could potentially be something that comes from within that can attack the marriage when there's not good boundaries. Conflicts, how we handle conflict, not so much what the conflict is, but how we handle it might need boundaries. And I'll go into some examples here in a minute. So I'm just right now wanting to present, like, here are some, areas or arenas of boundaries that we need to look at within the marriage. Another one is just where personal vulnerabilities. These are areas that I'm insecure in, and that can become an attack from within that sort of turns spouses on each other, and they start attacking each other versus standing back to back, dealing with the things coming at them in a unified way. So if there's a sin that easily entangles, that could affect boundaries and relationship in the marriage. That could be an addiction. It could be an affair that happened in the marriage, that it's done and over, but there needs to be guardrails and things that we learn from past hurts and pains so that we don't set ourselves up to experience that again. So those are things that I want you to think about. What are external things that can affect the marriage where boundaries might need to be put in place? And what are internal things that really think about those things are when we turn on each other because of something internal going on. So here's an example that I think is good. When you're in internal conflict because you're not at peace internally, you can only then bring and create conflict in your relationships because you're not at peace with whatever internal conflict is going on. And so sometimes, when we talk with couples in our marriage intensive, we're often talking about what are healthy boundaries that help you engage in a proper way and have the right conversation. And here are times that it's unhealthy to try to engage in a conflict or in a discussion that needs to happen. So just really think again about this idea of what can attack the marriage from within and what can attack the marriage from without, and what are things that we then can agree on moving forward that guard the heart of our relationship and honor each other and the Lord in those boundaries. So I want to talk about this idea of unhealthy boundaries. I've just, again, in the hundreds of couples, thousands that I've worked with in the intensive and in other type of settings, I've often seen that we try to instill boundaries in a reactive way. And what I mean by that is whatever feeling is in charge of you, you try to talk through that sort of lens of the feeling that just presented itself, of feeling rejected, of feeling, like a failure or feeling hurt or whatever. the feelings are important, but when we try to set boundaries in place based upon how I feel, those boundaries are really going to be hard to hold. And so, whether I feel bad and guilt and shame because I messed up with Amy, so I'll tell her I'll never do this again. That's not really a boundary. I'm just reacting to whatever the feelings are going on or whatever I'm experiencing in the moment. And so when we try to do reactive boundaries, that just doesn't go well. And, and here's examples. We can just say, stop doing that. I'm so sick and tired of you doing that. Don't do that again. Or I'm out of here. I mean, is anyone paying attention or listening, at that point? Is that really a constructive conversation or dialogue when you just react and you just sort of spew out whatever is the thought or feeling going on in the moment? Because there's also a good chance in your thinking that you're believing a lie at that point and you're speaking through the lie that just presented itself. Because reactive boundaries really don't have God in the picture. He's really exited stage left, and I'm just, again, whatever is going on inside of me, I just sort of vomit that out, and and then the other spouse is just reacting and sort of paralyzed, or oh crud, I just messed up with them, and it's just, I've seen that time and again just not work itself out well. The other one is this idea of, we're in the midst sort of this cancel culture where we put boundaries in place because we just cancel the person. I'm not going to ever talk to you again, or I'll decide when that, exists. And it's just really, I think cancel culture is sometimes avoiding hard things or hard conversations. And that cancel culture really works well for a conflict avoider, because then I don't have to go have a conversation. So I'll just put that unhealthy boundary in place of canceling you out, or whoever I don't like, or whoever offends me. And I'm not saying there isn't been, maybe effort made in trying to engage that person or talk to them. But again, if we don't have the right tools and ways to talk well, we're just reacting our way through that interaction or that relationship. And then again, we can be in relationship and we haven't necessarily canceled our spouse, but we're avoiding the relationship, we're avoiding hard conversations. We're thinking it's a boundary, but we're really acting or reacting in a passive or passive-aggressive way. By nature, I'm a conflict avoider and I'm a people pleaser. So, when Amy, my wife, if you ever met her, she's amazing. She's very good at responding, not reacting. She most of the time thinks through things before she presents them. Like, she can have a bad day and react, but most of the time she'll share something, but I'm still in reactive mode. And so when she asks for a boundary, this is the thought going on inside of me: crud, I messed up again. I can never do this right as a husband, ... I'm just beating myself up, going into sort of not victim mode, but I'm just a failure, etc. So then I try to accommodate her and just be like, okay, Amy, I'll never do this again. Let's put this boundary in place. But I can't really hold to it because I'm more in a passive, reactive posture. So it's not a sustainable boundary that I can agree to with her. And so I just want you to get this idea of, when I try to ask for a boundary or I respond to my spouse presenting a boundary, am I in a reactive posture? Because it's just not a sustainable boundary that we can keep to. Even, I would say, when there's been a clear offender offended, if we're just reacting our way through that, let's say an affair happens, and so we just realize, like, for this marriage to move forward well and somehow repair itself and heal, we need to set some boundaries in place. And so a lot of times, the one who had the affair is just, I'm not saying they don't feel bad and, horrible, but at the same time, it's more from a reactive posture because, crud, I messed up, I got caught. so I'll do whatever you tell me to do, without really there being a good dialogue or conversation about how that could look, what is sustainable, what needs to happen. And so differentiate between reacting and sort of escalating, feelings are all entangled, versus a conversation or dialogue that says, it's just a very different experience when I'm not in a reactive posture. Now, please understand that doesn't mean you can't feel hurt, doesn't mean you can't feel pain. In these areas of, say, an addiction or an affair comes to light, and what boundaries do we need to put in place moving forward as we choose to heal and restore our relationship. It's just we want to do it in a way that builds and grows, builds a solid foundation, and helps repair that, because if it's just done in a reactive way, I don't see how long-term that can sustain itself and that can really bless the marriage or relationship. Let me talk then about healthy boundaries and how that would look. So again, we talked about sort of external boundaries, external things that affect us when it comes to boundaries, internal, and then we just looked at unhealthy boundaries and sort of what's the motive or drive. Is it all about me? Is it for the marriage, etc.? Am I reacting? Am I responding? And so on. And so now I want to look at these. I think are important when establishing a healthy boundary, is that it focuses more on self than the other person, and it uses I statements. And so this is what I mean by that is you can ask for a boundary, or you can say, this is a really important boundary and this is really a non-negotiable for me, in this boundary. But at the end of the day, the other person has to agree to it, because if it's not a win-win, it's just not, again, going to be sustainable if you browbeat or, force or whatever that is. So I like I statements. Hey, I really thought or prayed about this, and I think I really need to put this boundary in place because I don't want to get to a point of reacting with you. So you could even say, hey, when we get to conflict, I want to hear and understand what's on your heart, but if it gets to a place to where we're going at each other, a boundary for me is I just don't see how that's going to be a helpful, good conversation. So I'm going to leave, hear my heart. It's not that I don't want to have that conversation, I'm avoiding it. I just want to do it in a way that we are working through it, not just reacting and getting on the hamster wheel and running in circles. So I need this boundary because I don't want to find myself getting caught up in reacting back or getting to a reactive posture when we go to talk about this situation or issue. So that's what I mean by I statements. It doesn't work well if you say, you need this boundary and you need to do this. Anytime you have you statements that you tell someone what they need to do, it just doesn't go well. I mean, you just get defensiveness back, you'll get a pushback, typically in those situations. One other is you want to keep, and I alluded to this, keep it healthy communication and conversation. Again, a boundary presented, a boundary agreed to needs to be through a dialogue or conversation, not a venting session. And so, as much as possible, you want to try to keep that connection when you're needing a boundary or you're saying, I think that this would work well for our marriage to have this boundary. Would you be willing to consider not having phones at the table when we're eating? That's a different way than saying, you need to drop your phone and I'm so tired of you having the phone and I've asked ... Now listen to me and let's agree to that. That again doesn't go well. So I think a lot of times it's the attitude, the heart, and the posture with which you present that boundary and communicate. That's important, for me, and I'm hoping it's important for you as well. So again, keep it in an arena of healthy communication and dialogue. Sometimes it's good to seek to understand, hey, I need this boundary. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Does that feel like I'm trying to control you? Do you believe that, this is good for our relationship? And then that dialogue or conversation can happen, because as much as you're expressing a need for a boundary, you're also inquisitive to see how that might be impacting or affecting, your spouse in that situation. Another one is when a boundary is asked for, just make sure you as the spouse receiving that boundary, that you respond well to that. Most of the time we're not asking for ridiculous boundaries. We're really saying this would help me. And so if I'm others focused and not just focused on me, if Amy presents a boundary and I know that that's important to her, Amy, I can see why that's important to you, and I want to help foster that, because that's primarily for you, but I could see how that could benefit me and our marriage. And so I want to champion you asking for that boundary, because typically boundaries being requested, if they're done in a good way, are for the benefit of the marriage, are the benefit of the relationship, staying connected. Again, going back to opposite sex, that has been an issue off and on that I've dealt with couples, is how to interact with opposite sex and when is it appropriate. And it might not be a big deal for me, but it's a big deal for Amy. But if I'm others focused and I see that that's important to her, then I want to give that to her, because, you know what, Amy, for myself, I probably wouldn't do it that way, but I see that that's important to you, and I can see how that really can guard the heart of our marriage. So definitely I want to agree and be unified in that boundary that you just asked for. And I might need to ask clarifying questions. Hey, how would that look in this situation? Because I might think that we're agreeing to a boundary, but sometimes there are different circumstances or nuances that maybe I'm thinking we're holding to the boundary and Amy thinks we're not holding to the boundary. And it's just often a understanding, or misunderstanding or miscommunication when we're talking through that boundary. So I'd really say the spouse, again, receiving the boundary from the other one, just responds well. And I'm asking you to see the heart of your spouse and why they need it. And maybe it's not to control you, it's because their heart is to want to be connected to you as the other spouse. Because again, we can bring beliefs in that say, oh, there goes Amy just trying to control me, asking for that boundary. She's just trying to dictate everything I do, when really maybe her heart in asking for that boundary is to stay connected. Because she has a good pulse on our marriage and where we connect well and where we don't connect well. And I want to honor that for Amy when that's important to her, and vice versa. If I ask for one and she sees that that's important, that she can give to me, honoring that boundary. The next is, I would really think in terms of, does this boundary help our marriage win, or will the marriage lose? Often when there's a boundary presented and it's not agreed to, the marriage will lose. So I really need to think in we and us terms, not just for my sake only, that I need this, because it might be something that is important, but it's not necessarily, which goes into the next one, maybe it's more of a preference or a difference of opinion. It's not necessarily an unhealthy or wrong pattern or behavior. It's just a difference of opinion. And so those are things that, I've got to think, how does this help our marriage grow? Does this help build trust when we participate in this? Another one is, can we hold to that boundary? Don't agree to a boundary that you can't hold to, because that will misfire and undermine the relationship. So you really need to think, if I present and ask for this boundary and it's agreed to, can I hold to it? Because then trust is eroded. When you sit there and say, this is a boundary I need, whether you're agreeing just to placate or accommodate your spouse, but you really haven't bought into it, it's going to erode trust. I've had time and again couples that come and say, we've been here before, they said they would do this, that they would agree to this, and here we are again, not holding to the boundary that's been requested or I thought was agreed to. And so really, I think that's why boundaries need to be thought through and not reacted to, is think through, pray about it, gain God's perspective and understanding. God, how do you want me to understand this boundary and why it's important. You know, and then from there you can assess and understand how to hold to that, because there are weaknesses in me that, again, being a people pleaser, I can back off that boundary when it's still really important because, oh, I don't want to upset Amy, or I don't want her to be mad at me, and so I'm not going to ask for that boundary because, you know, peace is of higher value than that boundary. And so that, again, is wrong thinking or motive. So I have to think specifically, like, if I ask for this boundary, can I follow through with it? And so, because then the other spouse sniffs that out and is like, ooh, I can take advantage of that. I've seen this before where they'll ask for a boundary or say this is important to them, but then they don't follow through. And I don't think they're intentionally looking to manipulate maybe or take advantage, but they just see that pattern. Like, I've seen this before. They ask for a boundary and then they don't hold to it, or they say this is needed, we agree to it, and then they don't follow through. And, you know, and so I don't really have to follow through with it because this has happened before and here's the pattern that we go through. And, you know, that can become confusing and just lead again to relational disconnect for the marriage. Again, I'm going to say create boundaries from a healthy perspective. And I understand, like, you know, forgiving, working through resentment and anger is a process, it's not an event. But if you try to put a boundary in place through unhealthy thinking or wrong thinking, or it's in a lie, and the lie is, you know, that my spouse is supposed to be my security all the time, and my spouse is supposed to, you know, accept me all the time, and you're trying to put a boundary in place through wrong thinking or unhealthy thinking. And that's why, again, I'm saying take time. Pray and think, God, where is my thinking skewed, or where am I out of alignment because I brought this lie into the marriage? So, you know, or this lie started to creep in, and now the enemy is at play, and, you know, so it's not a boundary that's from a healthy perspective, it's from an unhealthy perspective, or it's from a feeling that's attached to you. And so I'm trying to, you know, create that boundary through rejection, because your spouse cannot solve, you know, your rejection or your failure. Only God can do that. Now you can share, hey, I'm really struggling with rejection, but I want to make sure when I talk this through with you and ask for this boundary or present this boundary, it's not through me being stuck in the lens of rejection or failure. So I think lenses are very important to if boundaries succeed or don't succeed, or that thinking going on, or the feelings that are swirling inside of you. So that's why, again, it just takes time to think through boundaries and then present them. Another one is, I think one of the things that has been so important for me is just gaining God's perspective in that time, so that my boundary is from a healthy posture of, God, how do you want me to see this situation? God, how do you want me to understand what's going on? Because usually God's not going to point out what's a problem in your spouse. He's going to share an area maybe inside of you that's going on that says, Brandon, the way you're wanting to create or put this boundary in place is not from my thinking, it's your own thinking. So I first want you to align with how I want you to see this situation, and then I'll tell you how to create or ask for that boundary. Because I just think God's never at a loss with me, correct? God knows what's going on. He knows next steps. He's very aware. So why not take time to consider, you know, where's God's heart in what I'm thinking and what I'm wanting to present? You know, and so there are variances of, sometimes boundaries are just, you know, in small ways. Sometimes boundaries are in significant ways. And sometimes boundaries are needed that are non-negotiables, especially if there's been a significant issue that has replayed itself or is a chronic pattern. I don't know what that is. I don't have a qualification on, you know, if it's this issue, then it's non-negotiable. If it's this issue, but I'm thinking more in the area of, like, you know, an affair, or if there's been a pattern of that and you keep, you know, taking them back. And I'm not going to challenge what God's calling you to do, but sometimes there's, like, this is a hard conversation. If this boundary is broken for me, we're going to have to reassess our relationship and how it moves forward. Because this is an area that's a non-negotiable. I've prayed about it, I've sought wise counsel, I've talked through that, with others to make sure my heart's in the right place, that I'm not reacting. And so this chronic pattern is, needs to be assessed. And sometimes that's saying, I can't engage and talk through this issue with you until you first go maybe get outside help or counseling or a treatment center. I just don't see how a conversation is going to be productive until maybe I see different evidence of your commitment or self-work that needs to happen. But I like the idea of not demanding, but more presenting your boundary. I think that's very important to maybe the receptivity of it. Remember, just because someone agrees to it doesn't mean they bought into it. Because again, as a people pleaser, if my heart is more like to appease Amy, to just placate her, crud, I've messed up, have I really bought into what she sees as an important boundary? So I think those are important things that maybe I need to go get work on, because I've realized people pleasing is an issue that doesn't allow me to hold to a boundary. So I need to go do some individual work with someone else to think like, man, people pleasing is so dominant in my life and conflict avoiding is so dominant in my life because of wrong thinking. I need to reframe this, and I need someone to help me work my way out of my wrong thinking so that in the future I can agree to that boundary, or I can hold to that boundary that's being requested. And so those are, I think are, that's why I like intensives, and when we work with couples, we're helping them navigate through what are healthy boundaries, what are unhealthy boundaries. Hey, the way maybe you're trying to put this in place is pushing, the person further away. It's not from a place of potentially restoration or healing in the marriage. And so that's why I like, a third party involved when that's needed, especially if the couple doesn't have the right tools, the attitude of the heart is not in a good place. It's just things are so personal that I really can't get outside of myself and think through things in a healthy, good way. And so that's something that, we've worked with couples time and again on establishing healthy boundaries when it comes to communication and conflict, when it comes to a certain arena, say of, with work or an outside influence or something internal going on. And so that we can see momentum and we can hopefully see progress made when we do boundaries in a healthy way. And so I'm, again, wanting to focus on the principle of things. I'm not so much maybe get into every nuance or detail. I know boundaries, again, are the idea of allowing trust to be rebuilt, allowing healing to take place when there's been significant damage and hurt in the marriage. I just think when it's done from a responding posture and eliminating reacting through that, because again, reacting is just about you, it's not about the marriage at that point. And so that's why I'm saying really consider the marriage relationship, and does this boundary help our marriage grow, or does it hinder it from growing? And again, these are general ideas and general sort of guidelines. There's always the extenuating circumstance that can fall outside of that situation. Again, if there's been significant hurt and pain, like an affair, addiction, or something of that nature, those are hard conversations. And those are things that, the person who was offended, is not that they're more probably the one that leads in that situation of presenting the boundaries and saying these are the boundaries I need in order to start rebuilding trust in the areas of, reliability, things of that nature in the relationship. And so those are ones that, just consider sort of what is the situation, what is the circumstance, what is the issue at play. I get it too. If you've been married 20 years and you've asked for something for 20 years off and on, and we're having the same conversation in the same way, that's exhausting, because I thought we, again, had agreed to that, to find out we haven't agreed to that. what's going on? I just get tired. I start to check out because I don't know what else to do. Those are things that EXO can help resource you in different ways to help you navigate that and gain the tools and strategies that help put those boundaries in place and then stick to those boundaries moving forward. So as we come to a close, I know again there can be lots of maybe different questions that pop up or situations, and we won't have time to necessarily address those at this point in time in this conversation. But I do want to say, you can email info@exomarriage.com if you want to schedule a session with one of our coaches just to talk through this area of boundaries. I'm really big in principles of how to navigate the marriage life in a healthy way that builds a strong foundation in order for when boundaries are needed, not if, but when we are standing on a solid foundation. We're hearing each other's hearts. We're not just hearing words and facts. We're able to have a conversation that works through that situation to see those boundaries become part of the marriage relationship in those areas that are important. One area that we didn't touch on is sometimes technology. That arena needs boundaries. I mean, today, how often are we just tied to the phone and social media and all of those things and texting or interacting with friends or family members, and the marriage is suffering the whole time because we've not ever had the conversation of, hey, what would healthy boundaries look like when it comes to technology so that our marriage doesn't suffer and we can guard the heart of our marriage? Because a lot of times it's just maybe starting with a question. Hey, what are your thoughts or ideas about boundaries in this area? You probably have opinions on that, but sometimes in extending an olive branch, start with a question and get sort of what is your spouse's perspective in that area or arena. And then you can transfer to, hey, this is what I'm thinking when it comes to boundaries. What are your thoughts on what I just shared? And I'm talking about in normal circumstances, not the extenuating issue or circumstance that needs a harder conversation. I'm just talking about if the way you've tried to establish boundaries isn't working, we've got to reset and reframe and maybe approach it in a different perspective that extends the olive branch that says, I'm for you and with you as my spouse. I don't see this just as for me. I want to make sure your ideas and thoughts are included so that we can get to a win for our relationship when it comes to this boundary in technology or this boundary in how we spend our time and creating margin and making sure our marriage thrives and grows as we move forward. And so thank you again for this time. Just to mention a couple of things that you heard me briefly touch on is we do have our marriage intensives. Those are for couples who are hitting speed bumps. Maybe they're in crisis because of a lack of boundaries or a lack of agreeing and having sustainable boundaries in place. And again, I'm going to say a lot of times it's because we just don't have the right tools in our relational tool belt in order to see productivity in the communication that leads to establishing those boundaries. So if a marriage intensive coaching is of value, again, you can go to exomarriage.com. You can also go to info@exomarriage.com to get more information. Another thing that I would say is more for couples that are in a healthier place in their marriage is our vision retreat. I've found a lot of times a vision for the marriage of who we want to be as a couple and how we move that direction. Those are inherent boundaries because what's guiding us is the vision for our marriage based upon foundational character traits and values that establish our relationship. So as we make decisions, it's in line with our vision and mission and who we want to be as a couple. And that's a great way to just look at putting healthy boundaries in place in your relationship moving forward. There's also EXO Now resources. We just released Doing Marriage God's Way that Jimmy Evans did, and that is a new series that we've put together, a part 1 and part 2 series. So you can go to EXO Now and you can get that resource. And there is a session in there that does talk about boundaries. That's a really good talk from Jimmy Evans, that he alludes to boundaries and what does that look like and putting those in place. Other sort of additional information is Dave and Ashley Willis has some talks through EXO Now on boundaries, as well as there's other great books out there like Cloud and Townsend that talks about boundaries as well. So again, if you want to follow along in the notes that we talked about, you can scan the QR code to download the resource or companion guide to this talk, or you can click on the link in the description, and that gives you notes to refer back to. I want to also let you know that you can take our marriage assessment online at exomarriage.com, or you can click the link, I think, in this channel that will lead you to take the marriage assessment. And that just helps you gain an understanding of how healthy are we in our marriage. Are we, pretty healthy, semi-healthy? Woo, we're tanking. And then, from there, that we have opportunities through EXO to help you in whatever stage your marriage is in. If we're going to point you toward, hey, this is a way just to continue to strengthen your relationship or marriage, or, man, you're in crisis mode, we need to put some things in place that help you get through that crisis and move away from the crisis that's at hand. So, again, thank you guys for this time. I'm grateful, for this conversation and the importance of boundaries, and maybe having a different approach and understanding of why boundaries haven't worked for your marriage, because maybe of the way we've tried to approach. And if we can put in place some of these healthier ways to engage and posture ourselves so that we can see sustainable boundaries, I hope that information, was a blessing and helped you, just in moving forward in your marriage and looking through the front windshield of what God does have for your marriage, not what's been in the past, and dragging that with you into the present. So let me pray to finish out our time, and then let you guys continue to go about in your day. Heavenly Father, thank you for, again, this area of boundaries, and I know that's very important to marriages being healthy. God, there are different ways that we can put boundaries in place, and some of those exist just because of being unified and together. Maybe there's some good conversations moving forward with couples, but how they approach it can look different than maybe the way they've tried to approach it in the past, and understanding how to navigate that. If EXO Marriage can come alongside any of these couples who are in the throes of just needing boundaries, just not knowing how to get there, I just pray that you would make that evident and clear, of whether we come alongside them or you have another way that you want to accomplish those getting set into place. So we trust you for the time. Thank you that you're a God who is always for us and with us in any and every situation. We ask all of this in Jesus' name, amen.